Hi, this is Mr. Carvajal for English 1. And if you were absent on Wednesday, you missed the start of our test, our multi genre unit reading summative exam. And you want to be able to have read in advance so you can do your best on the test. And that's what this video is here for. So I'm glad you're here. Remember, you are strong, confident, and successful. Focus in, pay attention, read along, and you'll go a long way towards passing this test. So it's a test with two different readings: fiction, story, narrative, and a nonfiction informational writing. And we're going to focus on the fiction first, the hike. And let's look at the question that we're being asked here. In the hike, what does the narrator reveal about Mr. Arseno? Or maybe he's Hispanic, Arsenio, I'm not sure, but we'll call him Mr. Arseno. Support your answer with evidence from the selection. Use the space provided for planning. Write your response in the box. And of course, we're focused on what the narrator reveals, not what they tell us at the beginning, but what they show us throughout the story. Something happens that you notice, you see about Mr. Arseno, and as we read, be looking for that. So let's switch to the reading, the hike, and let's get started. No one, oh, yeah, no one ever looked forward to summer vacation more than Emily Arsenault. Every July, after waiting an interminable month after school was out, Emily and her family, which included her parents and two brothers, would go camping. Or, as her father liked to say, they would pack up the wagon and head for the hills. The truth of the matter was that the wagon was their 8-year-old SUV, and the hills were the Rocky Mountains. The trip was a tradition that began before Emily was born, although she was never quite sure how or why it had taken root in the Arsenault family. Her father, while one of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet, was not what you would call a mountain man. Setting up the tent alone could take the better part of a day, and even then they were lucky if it didn't collapse on them with the slightest breeze. When Emily was little, having her family all to herself in the mountains was heavenly. However, as she and her brothers, Zach and Bo, got older, that began to change. Being stuck for a week with their parents was no longer their idea of fun. Zach, who had never been a fan of the whole camping experience, was the first to bring it up. Initially, he tried to be subtle. When that approach didn't work, he became a little bolder. Nothing personal, Mom, Zach complained loudly one day about a month before the trip, but I'm pretty sure that a week of forced imprisonment with only Emily and Bo for company is against the United States Constitution. Suppressing a smile, Mrs. Arsenault ignored her son's comment, but it planted an idea in her mind that she decided to discuss with her husband later that night. What if they were to have another family join them on their vacation? When the idea was disseminated among the Arsenault clan, all concurred that it was indeed a great plan. They were even able to agree on which family they'd like to ask: the McGees. Not only did Rachel and Ed McGee have children in the same age range as Emily and her brothers, but they too loved the outdoors. Emily knew this because she had heard Mr. McGee speak often. Actually, it was very close to bragging about his great adventures. In some of the stories, he was leading a group of explorers to safety along the Amazon. Once, he said, he had to dig an ice cave for protection from a sudden blizzard while climbing some distant mountain range. Emily wasn't sure why Mr. McGee had been in such situations because he was a mechanical engineer and adventure wasn't part of the job description. She never said anything about her suspicions, though, because her dad's job wasn't much more exciting than Mr. McGee's. As a writer, Mr. Arsenault made up most of his adventures, too. Soon the time came to depart for their week in the mountains. As the two families caravanned into the Rockies, they noticed that there was still snow on the peaks. With that, it was decided that as soon as their camp was set up, they would climb the nearest mountain and have a snowball fight. Immediately, Emily was worried about how her dad's mountain man skills would stack up against Mr. McGee's. After lunch, Mr. Arsenault asked the group who wanted to hike. Mrs. Arsenault and Mrs. McGee decided to stay back at the campsite and make sure none of the forest critters got into the supplies. The 6 Arsenaults and McGee children and their fathers put on the hiking boots and warm jackets, gathered some climbing gear, and were ready to set out on their adventure. Before the climbing party left the campground, however, Mr. McGee decided to give them a tutorial on geometry of mountain climbing. As the mountain becomes steeper, he explained, the most efficient way to scale it is to go straight up. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, he said. Apparently, climbing a straight line requires a lot of stuff, because by the time the group left, Mr. McGee had so much gear hanging off of him, Emily was amazed he could put one foot in front of the other. Emily's father just nodded as Mr. McGee spoke. In all the years the Arsenaults had been camping, he'd made it clear that the point of being there was to have fun. As Emily watched her father, she was pretty sure he wasn't having any fun. Once Mr. McGee had exhausted his knowledge of mountain climbing, the group set out. The first part was relatively easy, with gentle rises that were easily traversed. But soon the easy parts gave way to rockier elevations. That's where the hard work began. Before Emily knew it, Mr. McGee was swinging a treble hook, aiming approximately 20 yards straight up the sheer mountainside, and instructing the rest of them to pull themselves up the rope to a point where the hook held firm. They were then to throw the hook up another few yards, and pull up again until they reached their destination. Mr. Arsenault looked at his children's faces, which were alternately looking up and down the mountain, clearly measuring the distance a person would fall if the rope didn't hold. He knew what they were thinking, so he casually said, "You know, Ed, I think my kids and I will take the trail around the side of the mountain and meet you at the top." "Okay," said Mr. McGee with great hesitation, "but it will take you much longer because, as you know—" "Yes, we know," interrupted Emily's dad. "The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line." Mr. McGee nodded, gave a small snort, and began harnessing his daughter, Megan, into the elaborate climbing gear. "I tell you what," said Mr. Arsenault, "if it takes us a lot longer to get to the top, you and your kids should just keep going, and we'll see you on your way back down the mountain." All agreed that this is how they would proceed, and off they went. Before long, Emily, her father, and brothers had walked a challenging path up the side of the mountain. Along the way, they spotted an old mine shaft, which their dad wouldn't let them enter due to safety concerns. But just outside its opening, they saw something. Buried in the dirt behind some undergrowth was an antique button-hook boot. Though admitting he was no expert in such things, Mr. Arsenault estimated the footwear to be at least 100 years old. The Arsenault crew didn't tarry long at the mine shaft because they were concerned that the McGees would have already reached the destination, and they didn't want them to have to wait any longer than necessary for them. As Emily and her father climbed further up the mountain, the sun began going down in the sky. Almost 2 hours after starting the hike, the Arsenaults arrived at the predetermined destination. It wasn't the highest peak on the mountain, but there was enough snow on it for a snowball fight. Now all they required was an opponent. They scanned the rocky bluffs around them, but Mr. McGee and his kids were nowhere to be seen. "They probably got tired of waiting and headed down the mountain a different way," said Mr. Arsenault resignedly. It was clear to Emily that somewhere in the recesses of her father's mind, he had hoped they would have beaten the other group to the top. "Let's start back," said Mr. Arsenault. But before they had taken a single step, they heard the sound of voices. It was the McGees, slowly pulling themselves by the rope up to the peak, where Emily, Beau, Zach, and Mr. Arsenault were already standing. The Arsenault children were tempted to gather snowballs and surprise the latecomers as they topped the ridge, but Emily's dad made it clear with one look that he didn't approve of such an idea. She knew, as her father knew, that the length of time it took them to get to the top was embarrassing enough for Mr. McGee, without getting a face full of snow, too. Being the last person in his family to reach the place where the Arsenault family stood, Mr. McGee looked at them in stunned silence before bursting into laughter. Although they got off to a rocky start, by the end of the week, everyone was having a good time. The summer camping trip was more enjoyable than ever, and both families had learned a valuable lesson. While it may be true that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, it's not always the fastest, or as Mr. McGee added, the most fun. All right, so think about this question again. What does the narrator reveal about Mr. Arsenault, right? That's Emily's dad. He's the one that said, let's take the side route. Let's go a different way. Let's not do it Mr. McGee's way. So think about what we read. Remember to use the key words. The narrator, what does the narrator reveal about Mr. Arsenault in your answer? Support your answer with evidence from the selection. And then we're ready to move on to the next one. Okay. The next one is the informational one. And if you remember, we took notes on organizational patterns. So the question is choose an organizational pattern that you notice in how to climb a mountain. Oops. In how to climb a mountain and explain how structuring the essay in this way helps to develop the writer's message. Provide some commentary to explain your thinking. So think about organizational patterns. If you go back to our notes, we'll talk about that here. There's compare and contrast, right? Tell how things are the same, how they're different. Cause and effect. Tell about a problem and what happens because of it. Procedural. How to do things like fix a lawnmower, bake a cake, etc. Persuasive. Convince the reader to believe or act a certain way. Description. Tell about a problem or issue. And finally, narration, right? A narrative. You're just telling a story. It may be fiction or nonfiction. Okay, so let's read the second one. How to climb a mountain. I climbed it because it was there. That's the answer English mountaineer George Mallory gave when asked why he wanted to climb Mount Everest. Mallory's famous quote echoes the feelings mountain climbers have had through the centuries. Just seeing snow capped peaks is enough to make them want to lace up their hiking boots. But it takes more than just desire to be a successful mountain climber. Many books have been written about mountain climbing. Some are how to manuals, some are detailed accounts of actual ascents, but each can help the would be climber know a little bit about what to expect when attempting to climb a mountain. After doing some research, experts suggest you start out on something manageable, like a hill, or even an artificial rock climbing wall if possible. The first thing to assess is whether or not you are in good enough physical condition to climb a mountain. Even if you are healthy and in relatively good shape, that doesn't necessarily mean you are in climbing condition. The challenges confronting a person while climbing are much different from those they may face during their regular exercise routine. Beyond the physical condition is the mental stamina a climber must possess. To continue pushing onward when all your muscles are screaming at you to stop, and the air is so thin it's hard to breathe, is a difficult thing that requires much training. Here are some basic facts you should learn before attempting a climb. Belaying. Ever wonder what's to keep a beginning climber, or even the most advanced climber, from making deadly missteps? Belaying is the answer. Ropes and pulleys are used to limit the distance a climber falls. Two people are usually involved in belaying, but it's also possible to self-belay. Communication. Knowing the language of climbing is essential to keeping yourself and your companions safe on the mountain. And rappelling. This is a technique for descending a mountain on a fixed rope using a friction device. What kind of training you do depends on what kind of climbing you're planning. Winter climbing requires different techniques from the ones needed for spring and summer climbing. Climbing a Vermont mountain in July is very different from scaling the Himalayas in December. One difference with winter climbing is being aware of possible avalanches and knowing how to dig an ice cave for shelter if necessary. The gear necessary for a climb is also unique to the particular time and place it takes place. An ice pick is a very important piece of equipment for icy peaks, but would be unnecessary baggage in a warm weather climb. Hundreds of mountaineering deaths occur each year around the world. The dangers in climbing are twofold. The first is an objective hazard, right? Think of objects, objects in your way. These are hazards that exist whether the climber is on the mountain or not. Objective hazards include avalanches, inclement weather, and similar events that are outside the control of the climber. The second set of dangers, subjective, right? Subject has to do with you. Hazards refer to factors over which the climber should have control. These include equipment failure, missteps due to lack of attention, fatigue, and inadequate or poor technique. Whether objective or subjective, these hazards can all have serious consequences. While it's true that objective hazards are out of the climber's control, such dangers should still be considered when assessing the threat they can cause. This is especially true with the twin hazards of weather and altitude. Being aware of current and impending weather patterns on the mountain is as important to safe climbing as making sure your ropes aren't frayed. Even then, every climber knows that weather becomes more and more unpredictable the higher you get. Although the weather can change with alarming speed, problems derived from altitude should never sneak up on a climber. It is hard to overstate the misery, not to mention the health risk, associated with extreme altitudes. An experienced mountaineer knows that the peril imposed by altitude sickness can end not only the climb, but could also end his or her life. Some people undertake mountaineering as a way of challenging themselves mentally and physically in ways they can't in any other endeavor. Others enjoy the element of danger that scaling extreme heights brings. Whether climbing as a professional, for a sport, or as a hobby, it's important to have the right equipment and know what you're doing before you start. Unless you're prepared, never climb a mountain just because it's there. All right, so let's think about it again. What organizational pattern do you see? Compare and contrast, cause and effect, procedural, persuasive, description, or narration. Pick the one that you think best fits it. Answer this question, right? Remember to use the key words. Organizational pattern that I notice is, and this helps develop the writer's message by, explain, give details, provide commentary, and then you're ready to do the rest of the test. All right. Thank you for paying attention. Thank you for working through these. And if you need any help or anything else, be sure and message me. Have a great day. Bye bye.